The month of January 2023 is coming to an end, but social media is still rife with this year's predictions. It seems to have become a rite of passage. Many are self-serving, although there are a few from neutral sources. But how does one find all these predictions, tie them together, and synthesize them into common themes? After all, what is the use of so many predictions unless they help us think differently so we can do our jobs better and make a difference? Fear not, because that is exactly what we are going to do today. Andrew Brust is someone you should know. He is a long-time analyst known for his deep research in data analytics and AI. Today, he brings to us his labor of love in compiling 2023 predictions from several different sources and turning them into meaningful takeaways instead of just noise. We hope this episode will provide some guidance while this cloud of uncertainty hangs above us. With that, welcome to the show, Andrew. So happy you could join us.
And very happy to join you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate getting a little more mileage out of all the work that went into the piece. So excellent.
Yes, and so the piece that Andrew is talking about is his article in the Newstack. He does this every year. And when I read it, I was struck by the compendium of information. And that's why I reached out to him. I'm like, what is the process? How long does it take? In other words, Andrew, why do you do this to us?
Well, it's done to me, so I feel, obligated to pass it on. Pretty much every tech company is forced by their PR people to generate all kinds of predictions at the end of the year. Some of them come into me as early as October, but I set them aside. I put them in a folder in my email, and I know that either at the end of December or the beginning of January, I will get around to kind of putting them all together. So basically, it's a big copy and paste exercise at first, quite a big one, because all those different email messages don't make a very handy document format, but I get them all in a word processing document, and then I actually read all of them. And it's not until really when I get to the end, or at least 2/3 of the way through, that kind of clusters or affinity groups start to emerge. And then once that happens, there's more now there's cut and paste, because I've got to move things around and kind of put like things together and get a sense of what everybody's trying to say. And I think that you mentioned a lot of these are very self-serving, which is true, but I think there's a lot of value in the consensus that can emerge.
Yes.
If we look at a Venn diagram of all these things, seeing where the intersections are, I think sometimes yields some gems, some pearls. So I try and find those, and that's kind of the way it is.
How long have you been doing this now?
Well, I've been writing about big data since 2010, and I can't remember the first year I started doing these prediction pieces, but it wasn't long after that. So it's been about a decade, let's say.
I see.
And and usually, one thing begets another, right? Because I do it, I get more stuff next year and next year and next year, right? It's kind of no good deed goes unpunished, or we could be more positive and call it a flywheel effect, but it's become a bit of a tradition. And I find it helpful for myself just to sift through these and put together a framework for thinking, not just about what's coming in the year ahead, but really what people are saying about what happened through the last year, right? Because a lot of this is hindsight, not really prediction. And that's okay too.
Yeah, that's great. In fact, I think in your article, you even mentioned hindsight as foresight or something like that, which,
right.
Yeah. So I like talking to Andrew. He's full of wisdom and knowledge. Andrew, just tell us a little bit more about your Microsoft credentials. I think those are super impressive.
Oh, thank you. I think sometimes people get a little bit worried about bias. I guess the interesting thing here is we have no predictions at all from anyone at Microsoft. So hopefully that bias is not, if it exists, is not going to figure into this. But I've been, I used to actually be a developer. So, and a database guy and a business intelligence guy. And most of my career, not all of it, but most of it was spent around Microsoft technologies, starting with the very first version of a language called Visual Basic. And I ended up on a project for a big consulting company that still exists, at a big bank that still exists. And the project was just, let's just say it was exploitive of the labor. We really were asked to do a lot with something that was very, very new. And that forced us to figure out all the extremities and all the add-ons that we could to leverage. And I just got good at it. And I did a project in grad school around the database engine in the thing. And I pitched, basically, I pitched my final paper as an article to a magazine that was then called Visual Basic Programmers Journal, and they said yes. And that's how I got started writing, and that's how I got, I guess, more visibility in the Microsoft world. That led me to become something called a regional director, which is a small program mostly of executives whose businesses are very tied to Microsoft, and also a Microsoft MVP, most valuable professional, first for Visual Basic, actually. And then because data became more and more important to me, I switched over to being a SQL Server MVP, which is now called a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. And there is bias. I really love the Microsoft technologies. I've used SQL Server for about 20 years now. No, I'm sorry, for about 30 years now. Forgive me. 1993, I think, is when I started using it, or maybe 94. And the BI stuff that came out of that, that's how I got into BI. When Visual Basic kind of became a web programming language too, that's how I learned the web. You stick with a Microsoft technology long enough and it becomes a bus that takes you around the industry. So
I have to say, Andrew, you in your typical style, you're being very modest because being an MVP is a very big deal. Being a regional director is even more of a prestigious thing because there are how many regional directors exist worldwide now?
it used to be around 150. I think we've opened it up now and it might be closer to 200. But I've been in that program since 2002,
Oh,
which is
wow.
which
Wow.
is when .NET came out.
Okay,
Oh,
got it. So we're going to pivot now to 2023. And
uh-huh.
so, Andrew, what I did was in the Newstack article, like you said, you categorize them into groups, So I created a very short one slide PowerPoint deck, which I'm sharing. I'll
Okay.
only show it for the first few minutes, but this is to give the viewers an idea about the different topics that we'll be talking about. So here are 9 areas that you've covered in your article. The first one is the impact of economy on our space and what we are hearing in that for that group. We'll talk about automation and how that's impacting. Then governance, security, data access, super important topics. Finally, data mesh. You cannot have a discussion without data mesh these days. That takes us to also data sharing, very important topic. We will talk about data observability, impact of the cloud on data and analytics, and in the other direction. And then Kubernetes is something that we sometimes in data and analytics don't really spend a lot of time thinking about, but it is something that is making inroads into what we do. And then finally, we will end with AI. So
Right.
sounds
Right.
good?
And that's a little bit contrarian to leave AI till the end, but I think it's important to do that. There's so much hype around it. Let's look at other things first, because AI really derives from so many other things before we get there.
That's perfect. All
Yeah.
right. So when I looked into the news tag and I started reading it, the very first thing we'll talk about economy, the headline you have there says recession drives efficiency, more judicious spending.
Yeah.
What,
Yeah.
what were your findings? And please educate us.
One finding is they should have put a comma after the word efficiency. I'm not sure how that comma got lost, but yes, it's driving efficiency and judicious spending. I mean, what's a little interesting is it's not super clear we're in a recession, but it is super clear that everybody's so worried about the impending recession. I mean, eventually we'll be in one. It's a cyclical thing that perception can be reality, and spending can become, I use a polite word of judicious, but it can become tighter. And we had a lot of consensus around this. We've got Mark Vanderweel at Fivetran. He's the field CTO over there. He said the
Founder of
global
HVR. He was the founder of HVR.
of
Okay.
HVR, which was acquired, yeah.
Yeah.
And he just, he sort of made the empirical observation that the industry's putting brakes on lavish spending, but he also thinks that that won't necessarily lead to an aggregate slowdown, but that the projects that do get funded will be more focused on particular use cases, and that will drive efficiencies overall. And his colleague Alexander Lovell, who's head of product at Fivetran, actually thinks that recessionary times make data-driven insights even more valuable because, without being data-driven, you kind of do everything based on hunch and intuition. And he feels that intuition becomes a lot less reliable when markets are in flux. So we don't want to say anything's recession proof, but it seems like there's a decent consensus that data, even in recessionary times, data is super important. And it's not just going to shrink and go away. Folks at Dremio kind of used this as a bit of an opportunity to take a pot shot at the folks at Snowflake. And they felt that a lot of companies, because people's Snowflake bills ostensibly are going up, are going to start to put up walls of approval and rules regarding who's allowed to use and access what. That may be a little overwrought, but it's something that we saw in the old data warehouse world. By the way, this is Tomer Sharon, who's their chief product officer, and Ben Hunson, who's their staff product manager, and Jason Hughes, who is their director of product management, saying that. And one more piece here is Matthew Scullion at Matillion. He's the CEO. And this is a bit of a cloud prediction. He feels that the age of just storing everything because it might be useful and running up your cloud storage bills is that's gonna recede. That the incurring surplus cloud costs just to store data, regardless of its usefulness, won't be advisable. So we do have a little gloom and doom here that says we're going to go back to the days when technology is more rationed, and where this idea of let's keep all the data, that might go away. I hope that's not true, but we definitely see some consensus that it might be.
Yeah, I was just reading today. Fivetran had a record quarter. So I think 4,000 customers, 100,000 connectors now, which is pretty phenomenal.
100,000? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. So on an average, it comes to like every company would probably have 25 fast connections on an average. I'm sure some have more and some have fewer. So that is the number they reported this week for the last quarter. And it's interesting. We all talk about Snowflake cost is going up. A lot of times when I talk to Snowflake customers, I don't see that concern per se sometimes, because some of these customers are saying that, look, we get so much value. In fact, one of the customers I know they collect a lot of satellite data every single day, and they started creating these data products which they're monetizing. So they're actually recovering the money that they spend on Snowflake. So it's a very interesting topic, because I think as long as there is value, the cost issue sort of goes into the background.
That's interesting. I mean, it's anecdotal, but I've heard the opposite story from certain customers that
Right.
things do kind of snowball in terms of expense. But yeah, I mean, I think in general, right, the world hadn't been leveraging data the way it ought to. So the fact that it now is a sizable spend to do that, but the ROI is high, a spend doesn't seem so bad if you're getting huge return on the investment. So
Right. Yeah. So that return on investment becomes key. But the point, it's a good point you raised, because we're getting into this 5G space, for instance, and edge computing is becoming bigger. How in the world are we going to store all that information? Where are we going to store it? Like, if you store it in the cloud, then the cost goes up tremendously. So it's interesting dilemma. I'm assuming that technology will advance to a point where it'll get cheaper and cheaper to store all this data. So
Hard to say. I mean, it's a little bit like work expanding to fill time allotted. I think data may expand to fill storage allotted. And then we get a wave of storage innovation where it becomes maybe an order of magnitude cheaper, and then the process repeats. So, but I would say that if we have too many years of just, damn the torpedoes spending and money is no object, we get very sloppy about things. And I do think it's good for our discipline, even if it feels a little depressing to have people kind of come down and put restrictions. It's still good to have a forcing function for us to be more efficient and to filter things and clean things up and get into a more austere mindset, because the next spending wave will come, and we want to be that much more ready for it.
Correct. Like, when data warehouses like Teradata first came out, and Netezza and some of these older ones, they were built in an era of scarcity when everything was expensive. I think except for the human labor, which probably wasn't that expensive, but CPU, storage, network, IO. And today it's reversed, like skills are hard to get and expensive, but the infrastructure has become cheap. So we are in this era of abundance where, it's like you just throw resources at a problem, and that's just not sustainable.
Agreed. And it's interesting that you mentioned Teradata and the expense, because it seems like there are enough people who are relatively new to the industry that they look at things like Redshift and they look at things like Snowflake, and to them it's new. And I say, no, actually, we've had this for decades. It's just that the mentality totally flipped. It turned upside down. It used to be all about, all right, what small subset of data can I get in the warehouse? And who shall I grant access to it? And now it's all about putting everything in there and organizing it and evangelizing it so that everyone uses it. So the tech isn't new, but the idea that it should be prevalent and it should be ubiquitous and it should not, basically its use should be unregulated, that ends up being the innovation. Also the ease of provisioning and so forth, right? That was never easy before.
Yeah, I think the user experience has gone up tremendously in the new space, in the new cloud-driven, although functionally we are doing the same stuff, but so we can talk about
Snowflake's idea of doing t-shirt sizes and a few clicks to get a warehouse started. That was genius, actually.
Correct. Even like zero copy clone, I can make a copy of the data in like instantly, scale instantly, do my testing, so that whole provisioning of environments and all that.
Sure.
So we can talk quite a bit about this topic, but let's move on to the next topic, which is actually pretty much related to what we just talked about. Your second headline is saying automation, not headcount.
Yeah. So this also makes sense, right? If we're going to be in an, I don't know, sometimes I see these cycles as we innovate a lot, we fragment everything, and then it comes time to do a compaction, where we have to clean up all the smithereens that we scattered everywhere. So, we've built all these things. We have the lake houses and the warehouses themselves, and we have all the data pipelines. And we've also got all this data governance that finally, and that's a topic in and of itself that has become a priority for everybody. So the question now is, instead of doing everything in a bespoke fashion manually, can we automate a lot of this? And there seems to be a lot of agreement out there that not only can we, but we should. And actually, I work independently, but I also am the category lead for data and analytics at GigaOM. And one of my colleagues there, Paul Stringfellow, I actually stole this from a webinar that a bunch of the analysts there did together, and I went in and looked at the transcript, and he said that customers will want to automate as much as they can because people have a lack of skilled resources. I think they're looking at IT vendors to solve those problems for them and to, quote, automate processes for me. It's a pushback on the vendors, really. Okay, you've given me all this stuff that I can do. You've gotten me hooked on it to make it kind of mission critical and routine. Well, now I'm pushing back on you so that you can make a lot of this more code driven and automated. And there's also a lot of companies in this space that are in the business of automating things. So of course we're going to get a decent amount of agreement here. We have someone named Satish Jayanti at who's the CTO and a co-founder at Coalesce, who thinks this is the general theme. Rather than growing teams, companies are going to look towards ways to automate, not just automate in general, like robotic process automation, but automate data processes specifically. The folks at Dremio think that lake houses will be automated. The folks at Exasol feel that data delivery is going to be automated through the automation of data pipelines and warehouse automation. And then Privitar, which is in the governance space, which I think we're going to talk about next, feels that, the work, which can seem rather tedious, of building out policies based on the logical use of metadata will enable automation of security and privacy controls, and that will provide economies of scale and flexibility. So obviously, of course, these companies have built platforms to help you automate that, but we absolutely need it because not only have data volumes increased, but the breadth of data sources has increased. We look at almost everything as a data source, even if it's not physically a database. There are so many connectors and drivers and APIs that make them look like that. And, luckily, the adoption has been good, but boy, oh boy, oh boy, it's completely unsustainable to be working with all that and doing it manually. So we're gonna need to automate.
So the volume of what we do these days is so high. You got to automate these things. Like Chat GPT is trained on 175 billion attributes, something like that. So it's like we talk about extreme scale these days. I find automation to be extremely critical for this upcoming data ops space, because let's imagine, we are getting a stream of new data that's coming into our pipeline, and we're going to build this analytics subsystem. So automatically checking for the validity of that data, finding out if there's an anomaly, automating, testing, notification, alerting, and then stopping it, like if something goes wrong. And this is where, sometimes, I debate with myself that you got automation, but then you need human in the loop, because sometimes you just don't know what went wrong.
Yes, the unintended consequence of automation can be the scaling up of errors. I mean, it's kind of frightening, yes. Right? And we've seen that in past AI endeavors, but look at ChatGPT and how it's generating stuff that's cogent and not trained on sort of unsavory talk that's out there on the internet and impolite outcomes, but unuseful stuff. Eventually we get it right, but there's trial and error to be had, and
Well,
It
what
can be
was that
frightening.
that Microsoft
Yeah, I don't remember the name, but
Trey?
yeah,
Was it Trey or something where they launched it with a lot of fanfare and then people fed it all kinds of racist and
yeah.
obnoxious things, and then it just started spewing out. So,
Yes, when your training data is the world of social media, be careful. Or
yeah,
you're going to have instead of artificial intelligence, you're going to have artificial trolling at scale.
yeah,
That's what that
yeah.
ended up being. But
Yeah, Clippy came to my mind, but I think it may have been called Trey, if I'm
yeah,
not.
no, it wasn't Clippy. Clippy was one of the animated characters in a very old version of Office.
Yes.
That is now the butt of many, many, many jokes.
Yeah. So this is an interesting topic because the next grouping actually dovetails right into what we're talking about, and that is data governance, data security, and data access. What is the consensus on that topic?
Well, again, data governance isn't new, right? The term itself and the discipline have been around for a long time, but for the very longest time, it was viewed as very esoteric and dry and not something really relevant to most people, especially non-technical people. But that has changed with the mainstreaming of data and data-driven operation, the importance of governing the data, not to mention, all of the regulations that exist and are continuing to be drafted. Regulation drives a lot of cycles in tech, by the way, because oftentimes regulation is overwhelming and onerous. And then the best way through it is to kind of build technology that helps companies be compliant. So we have a lot of that. We have companies that are in the space. Vanderweel at Fivetran says data security and access to data will be top topics of concern. We could all say that, but he said for C-suites in 2023, for people at the CEO and other C-level roles, this is now on the radar. And then we've got companies in the space like Privitar. So Dr. Suzanne Weller, who's the head of research there, says unstructured data now will need the same degree of governance and privacy protection as has been achieved for structured and semi-structured data. Dima Spivak, who's the COO of products at StreamSets, feels that the ability to scale simple to build pipelines and comply with enterprise governance requirements will be seen as important. So now we're extending beyond structured data, and we're saying it's now unstructured data and pipelines that are going to be things that need to be governed. And Sophie Stala-Bordillion at Immuta, who is their senior privacy counsel and legal engineer, that's a great title, feels that not only that, but companies are going to have to make their analytics environments or their governance layer is going to have to become an abstraction across multiple cloud data analytics environments. That's the only way we're going to be able to govern data that's in multiple locations, is to have a single governance layer around it. So the industry is definitely cutting out its own work for the next year. I think the next realm is going to be really helping people understand and not feel overwhelmed by the burden of governing their data. Make people feel empowered, make people feel that it actually, the importance won't go away, but that doing it responsibly will get easier.
Wow. Yeah, such a huge gap. Doing
Yeah.
it easier. I feel one of the most critical things that every vendor in every space needs to do is focus on user experience for the business, all the way from C-suite to a data engineer. How do you make life easier for them? Because right now we build our products with technology people in mind, but that needs to reverse.
Agreed. Yeah, typically what happens is there's a breakthrough and something new becomes possible,
Yeah.
but there's a long distance between possible and actionable for
Yeah,
especially for less technical users. And
correct. And which leads to then massive adoption
right.
because it's become so easy to use. In fact, Snowflakes, like we said earlier, the big thing was they made it so easy to use.
They
And
did.
so,
They made a lot of things easy. And yeah,
and,
I don't know that governance and security is as easy as it needs to be to set up.
so
But
there are
it's getting there.
certain things that can be made easy, even in governance security space. Like, you talk about Sophie Stella, who's the legal senior private.
Senior privacy counsel and legal engineer, Sophie
Okay.
Stella Bordillion at Amuda. Yes.
So yeah, so what Emuda has done with how do you create policies in using English language instead of writing identity and access management policies is a huge difference. Those IAM policies in cloud providers is a bane of existence for many people because they're so archaic and so difficult. So, but writing it in English using a UI and then having those getting enforced dynamically is already quite a advancement. And I think Immuta also touched upon federated governance layer. Is that correct?
Federated governance, yeah, specifically around multi-cloud environments.
I see. Which actually takes us very nicely to data mesh. So your headline said weaving a more sophisticated data mesh. What did you mean by that? And what are people saying about data mesh?
Well, yeah, I mean, you had Shamek Zagani on your show last week,
Correct.
right? So that's a bit of a tough act for me to follow to be talking about data mesh, but since she basically
By the way,
the
if I may interrupt, I don't
you
think
may.
you can have a podcast these days without mentioning data mesh.
Mm.
It's like, some years ago, you couldn't have an Academy Award without Meryl Streep. So, you know,
Right.
so
Right.
now,
Yes, we've had lots of waves, lots of buzzwords.
yeah.
I have to tell you, I'm a little bit data mesh skeptical, but the idea of making things less centralized and sort of devolving power to individual business units, I think has a lot of value. If for no other reason than it gets those business units to
Mhm.
buy in and see data and so-called data products as relevant, and that will make those things more effective necessarily, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big goals of data mesh is this whole solving this problem of data ownership. So there's some accountability. So this whole domain driven idea is to bring that accountability. That's one of the few goals.
Yeah, so Jens Grupman and Exasol actually, I'll play devil's advocate with myself, and my skepticism. He feels that data mesh initiatives will gain momentum, but misinformation threatens to slow adoption. And follows that up by saying companies must take responsibility for educating themselves to strengthen their understanding of what a data mesh is and how it can optimize their data management strategy. And then Hyun Lee, who's the founder and the CEO at Alexio, thinks, oh, sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. He's talking about data sharing, which we'll get to in a bit. But
No.
Vishal Singh, who's the head of data products at Starburst, says in the coming year, we're going to see organizations strengthening their data mesh framework through the use of data products. And data products are actually a big pillar of data mesh. It's this idea, and I'm gonna try and summarize at the risk of oversimplifying, but if we can have individual business domains put together data sets or APIs or applications that use the data and then evangelize the adoption of those things by other business units, other domains. That's what so-called data products are all about. The idea that you need to treat it like a product, you need to build it with the quality of a product, and you need to be sort of dedicating yourself to customer satisfaction around the use of that product. That's the paradigm. So much so that there is now someone at Starburst who has the title of head of data products. So
Oh, wow.
that's a thing. I actually think, though, that, you know, I hope Zhimek's new company will kind of take a stronger look at governance and not and silos. So it does make sense, I think, to deputize business domains to take ownership of their data, but there needs to be some centralized authority as well. And sometimes I wonder if data mesh has eliminated too much of the legitimate use of some kind of central body as well.
I see. Yeah, I think in her own words, the data mesh usage of this term is going to start fading away. It'll become like microservices architecture. It's a concept, but the focus will shift to the actual implementation, which is the data product, and making
Right.
sure those data products are delivering value through a consumer-friendly interface, and start moving away from very heavy technology bent of like access to tables, although that will still happen for power users. But for mass consumers, the access will be through products, and whether we call it data mesh or not is going to be less important than the
Just
adoption.
making it consumable. I mean, I don't have a section on semantic layers, but that's been a big thing in 2022, and that's absolutely what's driving that, right? You can't
Yes,
just throw raw data at people. You need to give them something consumable that's kind of
correct.
self-documented and has hierarchies
Yeah,
um, you know,
yeah.
I mean, funny enough, right? 20 years ago, when we were doing OLAP, online analytical processing,
Mhm.
that's what we did. We designed our measures and our dimensions
Right,
before we gave it to anybody. And that kind of went away. That was
correct.
too centralized. So everything went to, here's raw data and have at it. Now,
Right.
hopefully we'll come to some sensible middle ground between the
So
two.
I have this notion. See, last year, metrics layer rose and became quite a big thing. I think DBT
Yes.
announced one at their conference.
Yes.
So as we decentralize and we have domains with their own data, metrics layer becomes a very interesting common semantic layer access point. And interestingly, if you put a lightweight database underneath, like DuckDB, and you start caching the data. So you know what SSAS from Microsoft or Business Objects Universe used to do, where you had to go into the database. I wonder if the metrics layer will become kind of a data product with its own query engine, caching. What do you think? I mean, just a thought.
Um, I don't I don't know that they're different. I think part of having a data product is having semantics and a schema by
Mhm.
which that data can be navigated and understood. And then also
Yes.
because we've built out all these, we have all these, we used to have monolithic stacks of tech, right?
Mhm.
Which felt, I mean, to some people felt like a kind of dark ages, and that we needed to get past that. So but now we have all these different engines, and we have all these copies of the data, and we don't really have any kind of documented consistency from one to the next to the next. So the whole point of a metrics layer and a semantic layer is to get those definitions
Yep.
formalized,
APIs, calculations. Yeah.
right, right, and used consistently. And
Mhm.
data products are kind of about that too. Again, it's like, don't
Yeah,
just give me raw
exactly.
materials, give me
Yeah.
something refined. Don't just give me the library, give me a bookstore where I can, something's kind of curated and I can go browse very quickly and find what I
Yeah.
need. Mhm.
Actually, I had this funny thought that crossed my mind, which is like you go to a restaurant and the waiter comes to you and says, "We have the finest produce from the local farmers market,
Right.
all organic. You can have an organic chard, you can have dandelion greens, you can have the steak from this poultry place. What do you want to do?" And
Yeah.
I'm like, well, sorry, I came here for a finished meal.
Right.
Don't tell me how to put it all together.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yep. Yep, the burden of choice is a perennial feature of
Yeah,
tech. For
correct.
sure, for sure.
Correct.
And the cloud made it worse, right? There's so many, doesn't matter which cloud you're on. There are so many different services to pick from and choose
Correct.
from, and it's been put on the customer to kind of integrate them.
Yeah.
Or else it's been put on the customer's consulting budget to get that done. That's gonna,
Yeah.
I think, if I were to predict something, it's that's gonna change.
Right.
It
So
has to.
moving on, yeah, this is fascinating topic because it is, I think, going to be one of those major talking points, data mesh this year. But let's move
Mhm.
on to the next one about data sharing beyond the ad hoc. What do you mean by that, and what are the findings?
Yeah, well, I mean, for the longest time, right? We've always had data sharing. If I think back to my days as a junior developer, a lot, and going back to those early versions of Visual Basic, the data we got was dumped into CSV files by guys who were running the mainframes. That was a crude form of data sharing. And things got better. But if you think about a lot of the way data is shared, there was this old thing called EDI, electronic
Hmm.
data interchange, that still exists. Web services were about sharing data, and a lot of what happens is people we'll put data files up on a FTP share somewhere, or maybe a web share where things can be downloaded. But it's always that is very ad hoc, right? There hasn't been that much put in around making data sharing something that is as technologically refined as all the other bits we've been talking about. But it's even harder now because you need a way to share the data where there's trust and where there's governance, and when there is going to be data sovereignty issues, right, that's got to be taken into account, and ultimately you need a neutral third party that might host and share the data with other parties. So that's kind of what this whole section is about. And gosh, I saw Microsoft get kind of involved with this with something called Azure Data Share, but that really didn't scale past Azure, and I haven't seen it get a lot of momentum. But Databricks has added something to the Delta Lake standard
Hmm.
called Delta
That-
sharing,
yeah.
and that's open source because they've open sourced the Delta Lake file format and other aspects of Delta Lake. So not surprisingly, Fermin Cerna, who's chief security officer at Databricks, feels that organizations will adopt secure data sharing based on open standards. What do you think of that? That's not a coincidence, probably. And at Privitar, they feel that so-called privacy-enhancing technologies, or PETs, will take center stage in 2023, facilitating safe data sharing across organizations and borders. And that's what I mean about the sovereignty and how it's more complex. Scott Naw, who is now VP of Data Platforms and InterSystems, but he was, gosh, I think CTO at Hortonworks when
Yep.
Hortonworks
And
was still a
Teradata
separate.
before that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
When Hortonworks was still separate from
Mhm.
Cloudera, feels that this is going to start happening with IoT, and where IoT devices have always shared their data, that it's going to become more bidirectional, so that other data will be shared to IoT
Hmm.
environments and be used to train them. And that gets back to the edge computing that you were talking about.
Yeah.
And then Manjusha Matabushi at Talentica feels that there's going to be a blockchain aspect to this too, so
Oh,
that we're
wow.
going to see blockchain
Wow.
data sharing system architectures
Of course.
empower users to gain control over the ownership of their data. And that probably ties right back into the data products if we can extrapolate a little bit, right? If we're going to have
Yeah.
data products and we're going to share those somewhat autonomously, then we're probably going to need things like blockchain or whatever to assure their efficacy and
Correct.
the cleanliness of the data and so forth. So all these things, of course, do
Right.
tie together. Mhm.
And you also talked about data quality begets data observability. So
Yeah.
let's talk about that. What is that prediction?
Well, gosh, there is now a whole category. depending, I mean, it takes a little bit of a leap of faith because honestly, I think a lot of it is rhetorical, but there's a lot of rhetoric from a lot of corners of the industry around data observability. So, my analysis of this is that, and I think it differs from yours, but my analysis of this is that it really is about data quality and data profiling, relabeled, rebranded, because the whole notion of observability and log analysis and web analytics and all the analytics and data visualizations that could come out of that, that's pretty popular now. So if we can put data quality within that and call it data observability, that gets more interesting. But it's really about monitoring all sorts of aspects of data.
Right.
So not just quality, but also the freshness of the data, the volumes of the data. Basically, just operationalizing how data is flowing and having kind of a dashboard to help you understand if the health of the data is good. So my colleague at GigaOM, William McKnight, who also has his own firm, McKnight Consulting Group, he feels data quality will be subsumed into data observability. Lovell at Fivetran says, with data observability in place, organizations will have fewer regulatory hoops to jump through. That's interesting. I don't know if it's true, but it's interesting. And I think the idea there is that with observability, fully in place, that a lot of the things that regulations require us to monitor will be monitored in a formal and operationalized way.
Also, you're getting transparency. So regulatory bodies want to know what happened. So if you get that lineage, then it makes it a bit easier, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that opinion is fair. Bassam Khan, who's VP of Product and Technical Marketing Engineering at Gigamon, not to be confused with GigaOM, says that deep observability will help detect rogue activities. So that sort of makes sense if you're looking at kind of intrusion detection or just anomaly detection. Then clearly data observability is going to help you with that. So Bassam says that anything could be coming from users, from cloud app developers, from bad actors, such as running peer-to-peer applications or crypto mining servers, etc., that data observability will help us there as well. I do think that kind of makes clear, though, that the term data observability is kind of a catch-all umbrella term for a lot of facets of monitoring data and then acting on what's observed.
Yeah, just as an example, yesterday I saw a Datanami article about a data observability company raised a Series B, huge amount, a company called Crux Data. I was shocked. I was like, wait, I cover the space of data observability. How come I've never heard of this company? I went to their website, not a single mention of data observability. It's not data observability. It does ingestion of large amounts of data. At the very best, it's a data integration company, not observability. So I think this whole observability space is mired in confusion. The first prediction you said was data quality will be subsumed by data observability. Yes and no. Yes, because you need to observe the state of data and hence quality, but data observability is not doing data remediation. So that data quality doesn't need you to just observe, it needs somebody to fix it too.
Yes. Well, that's an interesting thing, because as we look at data quality, just on its own, it used to be data quality was about not just evaluating it, but fixing data quality issues. And now actually data quality as a category has kind of divided into things that monitor it and things that remediate it, as well as monitor it. And the stuff that just is on monitoring, I've noticed, has come to brand itself data observability.
Yeah, it's like catching the data quality problems for the new data as it's coming into the modern data stack. And how do you stop that rot and stop bad data from coming in? But what about the petabytes, hundreds of petabytes of data that's sitting in your legacy data warehouse? That is a different problem, so the and also, by the way, do want to also say that data observability includes data quality, pipeline observability for reliability of the infrastructure, FinOps, business ops. So it's actually, and I really liked the last prediction that you said from Bassam, the fact that it needs to have security also. Today, security sits outside of data observability, but I think it needs to be brought in. So.
Agreed.
All
Well,
right.
there are lots of categories and subcategories of data management that have, I don't know, articulated themselves separately, and I do think
Yes.
at some point we're going to see them come back together.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your next grouping talks about data and cloud, and
Yeah.
you call it text, chicken, and egg.
Yeah. So it was that the cloud was driving all these data initiatives, and there were a few predictions that the opposite might happen. So Dupree's at Privitar said that pragmatic data-focused programs will replace general cloud migration initiatives. So in other words, these kind of general initiatives to say, all right, we're going to move to the cloud, right? Just generally speaking, lift and shift, whatever, that actually data, instead of being a facet of that, is going to be the driver of that. That it's really going to be about moving data to the cloud that gets the organization and its tech to the cloud overall. And then David Meyer, who's the SVP of product management at Databricks, says something similar. The data platform will emerge as the central driver of multi-cloud strategy. So in the first case, it's the cloud in general. In the second case, it's, well, if you're going to have a multi-cloud strategy, what's going to drive what your primary and secondary clouds are? Mr. Meyer didn't say that. I'm inferring somewhat, but and then the CEO of AppFire, Randall Ward, said that data residency across geographies, there we go back to the sovereignty issue, will become a key differentiator when selecting cloud providers. So data is going to drive people to the cloud. It's going to determine their multi-cloud strategy, and it's also going to drive their vendor selection. If we kind of concatenate these three predictions. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. It's great, but it's music to my ears as a data professional. I love it. So, we have only a few minutes left. So let's go. We have two more predictions, categories to talk about. Kubernetes on Autopilot is the next one.
Yeah. So I was really gratified to see this because I started getting kind of intimate with, well, intimate's the wrong word, but familiar with Kubernetes a couple of years ago when I was one of the beta testers for SQL Server 2019, which had this whole thing called big data clusters, and it all ran on Kubernetes. And at the beginning, you don't have the UI tools, right? Because they're still being developed. So at the beginning, to get everything running, we had to go down to the command line and do these all these kubectl commands, which is Kubernetes control, kubectl. And so I got to see the power of the command line and all that, and the API, and boy, it was, it was elaborate, it was intricate, it was cool. But to me, that's a huge pain in the neck to be like having to understand about nodes and pods and all these different constructs and all the commands to provision them and manage them. And so I always thought, like, this is great technology that shouldn't be seen, like it should be in the background. And there are a few predictions that kind of come around to my way of thinking. So Mr. Lee at Alluxio says that the main bottleneck of container adoption is going to be the shortage of talent with the skill set for things like Kubernetes. Spivak at StreamSet says companies will likely want to get out of managing such complex systems and leave doing so to a smaller number of service providers, right? He doesn't think that it's going to go away, that Kubernetes is going to go away, that it's useful, but they'll continue and be extremely valuable, but people aren't going to want to manage it all themselves. I mean, it used to be we all managed our own email servers. We don't really do that anymore. So And then Altair, remember Altair? So they exist in a new form where they're very focused on high performance computing. And they kind of noticed that, boy, oh boy, a lot of the AI work, a lot of the machine learning work that was going on, usually were running on Kubernetes clusters.
Hmm.
And that, this is an opinionated statement from them. It's become clear that these systems, meaning Kubernetes and containers, are designed for microservices and not for the bursty, computer intensive machine workloads now required for deep learning. In other words, they think deep learning is really going to run better on the metal than in containerized, virtualized environments. So there we do have one prediction that says not only will Kubernetes and its ilk be abstracted, but that it actually won't necessarily be adopted as widely as it is right now.
Oh, wow. I know data stacks, for instance, has a 1,000 node cluster to run Spark workloads,
Mm-hmm.
and it just comes up like automatically. If a node fails, it self heals, restarts it. So interesting. And
Yeah.
since you talked about machine learning or deep learning, so the last point we have is on AI,
Yeah.
which is such a hot topic these days.
It is. And like I said, let's leave it till the end, because if you just want to hear about Chat GPT and AI and deep learning, there's plenty of places to go. But there were a few specifics here that I thought were interesting. So Dave Simon, who's a HANA's co-founder and CTO, said that it's sort of interesting that models like ChatGPT are going to be, and natural language processing models in general will actually find a place where they can be used not to generate natural language, but to generate SQL.
Mm.
So if you think about that, it's all about natural language query, which we've had for a long time. I mean, products like ThoughtSpot are premised on that. But you really haven't been able to use completely natural language to generate your SQL. You've had to kind of use a sort of restricted syntax of English or other languages in order to kind of make things come out the right way. And I think what people are saying here is maybe we can use generative AI so that we'll have much more forgiving interpretation of plain language into very precise SQL. So we'll see what happens. I know a lot of companies are absolutely thinking about it. And then, NVIDIA had so many predictions on AI that they set up a whole web microsite with them.
Oh,
So
wow.
I cherry picked just a few. And Carrie Brisky, who's their VP for AI and HPC software in general, sees the rise of these large language models, these language learning models, that they'll actually drive, they'll go beyond English, which is good, and will be used across business domains and will be used for things like generating catalog descriptions and even summarizing medical notes. And Actually, there's a lot of healthcare in most of these. So Manavir Das, who's VP of Enterprise Computing there, thinks that generative AI will bring massive advances in personalized customer service, drive new business models, and pave the way for breakthroughs in healthcare. And if healthcare is like a ancillary theme, well, it turns out Kimberly Powell is the VP of healthcare at NVIDIA and says 2023 is the year when biology becomes information science, and that the capabilities of AI models will give drug discovery teams the ability to generate, represent, and predict the properties and interactions of molecules and proteins, all in silicon. So in effect, I think Kimberly thinks that we're going to be able to do lots and lots of sort of drug trial simulations using computer models, and that will hopefully accelerate the process of getting new pharmaceutical products in market, and for that matter, keeping ones that are harmful out of the market. And then last and not least, Azita Martin, who is the VP of AI for retail CPG, consumer packaged goods and quick service restaurants. And little piece of trivia, when I worked at Datamere, when I first got there, she was the VP of marketing and she was my boss. And
Oh, wow.
she popped up in the whole encyclopedia of predictions, coincidentally. And she says, quite logically, AI will enable more frequent and more accurate forecasting, ensuring the right product is in the right store at the right time. Also, retailers will embrace route optimization software and simulation technology to provide a more holistic view of opportunities and pitfalls. So hopefully what we can get used to is that the issues around supply chain inefficiencies will be things that
Hmm.
can be mitigated by AI. Hopefully
So,
that's true.
Andra, yeah, I found it very interesting when you said how natural language processing, these large language models will help write SQL code. Actually, it's not. I don't think it should be a surprise because talking about Microsoft GitHub, which Microsoft owns now, their Copilot is already taking over a huge bulk of code that's written. I think there are over 1 million developers, and
Sure.
so have you tried
Yeah,
it? Is that something?
I haven't tried it, but yeah, I think there's a lot of awareness that the models can generate kind of conventional programming code,
Mhm.
but these folks are almost taking it back to a simpler case of saying just generating declarative SQL. And then if you imagine plugging that into analytics,
Yeah,
it theoretically should help lots of people without data skill sets become much more adept at using data
correct.
because they'll be able to talk to their data,
Yeah,
which is something that a lot of vendors were trying already,
yeah,
but with the limited ability for natural language to
right,
really be
correct.
interpreted well. We've had to set up ontologies and synonyms, and this
Correct.
ought to help.
That is amazing. This has been absolutely fantastic. So, Andrew, we're top of the hour. I want to be
Sure.
respectful of your time. So, we want to stop here. But thank you so much for sharing all of this hard work of bringing together what industry leaders are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to share it.
You're welcome.